Hello all, in this session we are going to learn integrity constraints and types of integrity constraints, namely domain constraint and entity integrity constraint. Firstly, what is an integrity constraint? Constraint is a condition or the rules which you apply on a table, ensuring that the data stored in the table must be accurate or consistent. Here we have an example for student table. For a student, whenever a value is to be inserted for this Aadhaar number attribute, make sure that only one Aadhaar number is entered for each student. So here we have applied an integrity constraint saying that more than two Aadhaar numbers for an individual or an student is not allowed. So this is the constraint which you have applied, or the condition is applied for this attribute. This is an example for integrity constraint. Now let us see different types of integrity constraint. Namely, we have domain integrity constraint. Now, what is a domain integrity constraint? Domain is nothing but attribute. Or in other words, domain is nothing but a column name. So constraint is a condition or a rule. It is applied for any of the column such that whenever the user is inserting values for that column name, ensure that the values are valid. For example, here we have age as a domain. Now, when a domain integrity constraint is applied for age, the user, when he is trying to input value for age column as a string, then it is not allowed. DBMS should ensure that only integer values can be entered into the column, because age cannot be a string type of data. Age can only be of integer type of data. So this has to ensure that the values that are entered for that column must be only of type integer. So thereby it ensures valid data is entered into the database. So this is about domain integrity constraint. Now let us move on to the types of domain integrity constraints. Namely, we have not null constraint. So here we have an example for employee table. These are the attributes. Let us assume there are three different attributes, namely employee ID, employee name, and salary are given for this employee. And there is a not null constraint applied for this employee name. It is because every employee must have a name associated with them. Every employee has got a name, and thereby the values which you enter for this column cannot be null. The name of the employee must be known. Then only the record of that employee is inserted successfully. If the name of the employee is not known, and if you are trying to put null value for the employee name attribute, then it is not going to accept, which means the table for the employee will not be created because you are violating not null constraint. Now let us move on to the other type of domain integrity constraint, which is known as check constraint. So check constraint, when it is applied on a table, it can limit the values to certain columns. Here we have an example. Let me take an example. Create table employee. Let the attributes associated for employee be ID, and the type is an integer type because the values for ID must be of integer. Comma, I'm going to take another attribute as salary, and I'm applying constraint for this salary column. So what is the syntax we have? Constraint, constraint name. The constraint name be check constraint. And the condition that I'm applying for this salary attribute is the values when the user is trying to input for this attribute must be greater than or equal to 50,000. If the user is trying to input values less than this range, then it is not going to accept. Now let us move on to entity integrity constraint. So here entity integrity constraint is nothing but we are talking about the primary key. Primary key is a key attribute which can be given to any of the column name such that that column name must be able to uniquely identify the record of a particular employee or any entity. Example, I have two column names, say employee ID and employee name. So among these two, which among these two can be applied as a primary key? If a primary key is applied for this particular column, then can we ensure that this is going to uniquely identify the record of an employee? May or may not, because for every employee, they has got different IDs, unique IDs, whereas there may exist two or more employees with the same name. So if there exist two or more employees with the same name, then you cannot identify the employee record uniquely. So as we know that every employee has got unique number, then EID can be considered as a primary key in this example. So this is about the primary key, and this primary key will not allow null values to be inserted. When null values are given for a primary key attribute, then it is difficult to identify the record or a row of that particular employee. So thereby ensure that whenever a primary key constraint is applied for an attribute, it is not allowed with the null values. Now let us see the execution of not null constraint, check constraint, and primary key constraint. Before that, I'm going to make use of the database. Let the database be AB, which I have already created. Now I'm going to create a table, create table, table name. Let the table name be employee. I'm working with not null constraint, employee ID, EID, and the type for which this attribute is going to accept is only of type integer values, comma, employee name, and the type is varchar, as it is going to accept only string kind of data. The size is to be mentioned over here, comma. As I said before, every employee is associated with some name. The values for this employee name cannot be equal to null. So I'm enforcing not null constraint for this particular attribute. So write not null, comma. Let there be another attribute, say salary attribute, and the values which you input for this salary attribute is again of type integer. End with semicolon, click on enter button. Now it says query OK, which means this employee relation table has been successfully created. Now I'm going to insert values for all these column names, and let us check whether by violating this not null constraint, the record is successfully inserted or it is rejected. Insert into table name. My table name is employee. Values. The first attribute which you have is employee ID. So the value which you have to give here is integer, comma, employee name. Let the employee name be ABC. As it is a name, enclose it in double quotes, comma, and let the salary be some 20,000. Close the brace, end with semicolon. It says query OK because we have not violated not null constraint. Now I'm trying to violate not null constraint by just replacing this ABC by null. Now you can see that ename cannot be null is a message which is being displayed. So which means as we have applied not null constraint for that ename attribute, you cannot enter null values over there. So this is about not null. Now we are going to work with check integrity constraint. I'm going to take the same table. As the table for employee is already created, let us rename the table as employee 1. And check constraint, I'm applying for the third attribute, that is for the salary column. So here I'm writing constraint. What is my constraint name? Check is my constraint name. Salary, when the user is trying to input, should be greater than or equal to, let's say, 50,000. Close the brace, end with semicolon, click on enter button. Now I'm trying to input values for the employee table. So the values which I've given for employee table is less than 50,000. That is for salary attribute, I've given only 20,000. And let us check whether this value is being accepted or not. So before that, I'm going to give name for the employee name attribute. Let it be ABC. Click on enter button. Now you can see that check constraint is violated because it is going to check whether the value which the user is entered is falling under this range or equal to this particular mentioned condition. Thereby, this record is not inserted into the table. Now I'm going to replace this 20,000 by 80,000. Click on enter button. Now query OK, which means that particular record is successfully inserted. So this is about the check constraint. Now let us work with the primary key constraint. Take the same table as employee 1 table is already created. I'm renaming this to employee 2. And as said before, primary key constraint is used for uniquely identifying record in a relation. So ename cannot be a primary key because there may exist 2 or more employees with the same name. And thereby I'm applying primary key for employee ID column because for every employee, there is a different employee ID, unique employee ID is given. Now let us check whether the table is created or not. Query OK says that employee 2 table is created. As said before, primary key constraint is something that key attribute cannot accept null values. Now I am trying to insert null value for employee ID. And let us check whether the record is successfully inserted or it is rejected. So in the place of ID, I'm trying to insert a null value. It must show you with an violating constraint message. So EID cannot be null. EID cannot be null because it is a primary key. I'm changing this and I'm giving some value, say let it be 10. Now it is going to accept this record. Very okay. So this is how we are working with the not null check and primary key constraint. Hope you all have understood today's session. Thank you.